Have you ever seen a sensational event on the news and wondered what really happened behind the scenes? Have you considered the human behaviour that drives public uprisings and insurrections? And what would you do if you were the leader on the ground during a crisis, one that had the potential to escalate into something much worse? Today I'm joined by former New South Wales Police Minister Carl Scully and former Deputy Chief Commissioner Mark Goodwin. Carl and Mark were the leaders on the ground during the infamous Cronulla Riots of 2005. And we're giving them the chance to clear the air about what really happened on that day. We'll explore the psychology behind the human behaviour on display, as well as the leadership lessons they learned from this life-changing event. Enjoy part one of this two-part series. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by two special guests, Carl Scully and Mark Goodwin. We're commemorating today, it's hard to find the right word, but we're commemorating today the 19th anniversary of an event that happened in Australia that was very much flamed in the media and talked about for many years afterwards. And it was called the Cronulla Riots. And we're going to hear from Carl and Mark, who were as close to the action as you possibly could, about the inside story about what really happened on that day, and to celebrate their book, which has just been released, called The Cronulla Riots, The Inside Story. And it is an interesting story. Now, to put this in context, who is Carl and who is Mark? Well, Carl has had a celebrated political career in Australia. And at the time of the Cronulla Riots, he was the police minister. And for Mark, he was the assistant police commissioner, but he was also the police officer in charge on the day at the event, leading all of those police officers into danger in terms of what was needed to happen to quell what was potentially going to be quite an uprising. Now, there's quite a lot to this story, and for our international audience, you may not be aware of this, but have a listen to the words I used. Cronulla Riot. So this event happened on the 11th of December 2005, and it started on Cronulla Beach, and it started as a territorial battle between people from different suburbs and different ethnicities battling over, let's say, the occupation of one beach. The way it was then reported then inflamed based around race or based around all kinds of things that were not necessarily what really happened. And that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to give Carl and Mark the opportunity to clear the air from the inside story about what really happened and whether it truly matches the way it was reported, not only on the day, but in the months and the years afterwards. So without any further ado, Carl and Mark, I'm going to come to you first here, Carl. I want to give you the opportunity to hit this first one right on the head. You talk about 3 misnomers associated with the way that this event is even labelled. Tell us about the misnomers.
So firstly, it's always named as having occurred at Cronulla because in a sense that's where it started. But with the revenge attacks, they emanated from places like Punchbowl and Lakembra in southwestern Sydney and in convoys of cars spread out. And the riots that followed the initial event on Cronulla Beach happened at Brightmoor Sands, at Arncliffe, at Woolooware, at Maroubra, outside the mosque in Lakemba. So it was across Sydney, and the fear was right across Sydney. So we say it's a misnomer to call it Cronulla. A riot in Paris about 3 weeks before that happened in a suburb and spread across Paris is called the Paris Riots of 2005. Now, the racism is, there's no doubt there were thousands of text messages sent by both sides in this conflict, and they were both deeply racist in flavour. And so we say 2 essential things. If it was racist from Cronulla's end, then it was also racist from Lakemba's end, because when you look at the young Lebanese men who sent thousands of text messages out, they were just as unacceptably vile as those sent out by almost white supremacists pretending to be locals, and some were locals. So we challenged that. But we also challenged the notion that it was a racist event because it went away. It never came back. And so a lot of the people we interviewed put the view, and there's sociological research to back this up, that it was racially badged to corral the tribes into a conflict that was caused and inspired by other things. And of course, then whether or not it's a riot was another matter. But they're the essential ingredients of what we're putting in the book.
Yeah, really interesting, Carl. So I've got to say that stigma sticks today. That people still think of Cronulla and the Shire, and sometimes, whether it's bra boys or other things come to people's mind that sticks today.
Here's the challenge, Mick. Anyone of your audience living anywhere in the world, whether they're Aussies or not, whether they've been to Australia or not, or if they remember this time or not, just Google the Cronulla Riots. And the only videographic and photographic evidence anyone will get is 5,000 people allegedly rampaging around Cronulla looking for Arabic people to assault them. And what in fact happened was 200 or 300 misbehaved and did do some awful, despicable things over about 6 or 7 hours that editors have spliced together into a few minutes of TV coverage. And that's all you get. So we found social commentators and academics and students now wanting to know, even people who might be more informed on this than you'd think. It is overpowering in terms of presenting a truth to anyone wanting to learn about it. And when you look at the front page of our book, that was the only photograph of hundreds of photographs of the day that actually showed what happened for 95% of the time. Police looking at the crowd, looking at each other, and a number of people looking at some spruikers. And so we say, what was really going on here? It's not as it's been reported. There was much more going on in the revenge attacks, and Mark's probably better placed because he was directly in the line of the intelligence and the activity. But the activities in the revenge attacks were, once again, 200 or 300 people committing quite violent acts. And so we say 200 or 300 out of tens of thousands of people living at Cronulla does not make a racist Cronulla. 200 or 300 violent criminals in Lakemba doesn't make for a racist Lakemba. And so it's only a few hundred people, Mick, but it's got this videographic and photographic record that presents a truth of inebriated, boganic white trash from the Sutherland Shire. And we wanted to out that. It's simply not the truth. But if you Google it, you get presented a truth that's almost impossible to overwhelm with the evidence of what actually happened. And that's what Mark and I have tried to do, to leaven the record with the evidence and the facts of what actually occurred, and then to question it. If it was only a few hundred people behaving despicably, then what was really going on, and why has it never happened again? That's probably a good cue for Mark to come in at that point, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your view on the same, Mark. What's your perspective?
Look, I agree with Carl. It was an issue that there was such a beat up by the media in the lead up to it. To be honest, it started with an assault on the lifeguards at Cronulla Beach by some young Arabic Muslim men that were at the beach down there. That was the spark point for it. But of course, there'd been a lot of build up to that, and there'd been lots of reports of intimidation and behaviour down there that was very problematic. And the people of Cronulla had basically had enough. And there's always this issue where there's tribes and competing tribes when a flashpoint, if you like, occurs. So that's what did occur. But the media took that to the next level. To be honest with you, it was a nasty assault. It was a common assault on the beach. And then next minute it was who'd stolen the sons of Anzacs and the lifesavers who saved your life on the beach all summer have been assaulted by the Muslim Arabs. And I think at that time, you've got to remember that these were the era where there was the 9/11 attacks and Bali bombings and those sorts of things. So they're feeding off that, in the back of that, the media had a field day in the lead up to Christmas. As the media often do, it's like, who's the Grinch that stole Christmas this year? And that the massive media beat up to it then caused hundreds of thousands of text messages to be circulated calling for a Reclaim the Beach protest, and some of them quite nasty and inflammatory and racial. And the media fed off that, and the media broadcast those, and the whole thing just got out of control as far as media coverage. And I've never seen anything like it, to be honest with you, in my entire police service. Then that led to an expectation on the day that the media were going to have a story to tell. And every journalist, I think, in Sydney was there on the day, literally looking for something to record. And the looks on their faces by half to 2/3 the way through the day was powerful, because they had nothing. And in actual fact, as Carl said, the photo on the front of our book is what the day mostly looked like. It was the cops looking at the rubberneckers, who were most of the crowd, and those rubberneckers looking at a few spruikers in the crowd, which were not from the Cronulla area or the Sutherland Shire at all. They were white supremacists. They turned up in great big jacked up utes with Eureka Stockade flags in the windows and hopped out, and they're wearing like red, white and blue stars and striped bandanas on their heads. Certainly not the beach wear that you would normally see at Cronulla. And they're in the crowd, and they're spruiking and they're chanting, and they're starting chants in the crowd. And of course that then started the camera work. And as the day wore on and the alcohol wore on, stupidly, a lot of young people got involved and sucked up into this nonsense. But I think I counted that over a period of about a 7 or 8 hour day, I think there was 9 scuffle incidents that occurred. And yes, look, some of them were nasty, but police were all over it. They were over in literally seconds or minutes. They swarmed over by police and stopped. So that then provided fantastic footage to be, as Carl has already indicated, strung together in quick succession by editors here back at the newsroom. And then that then made it certainly look like, with excited newsreader voiceover, made it look like that entire 5,000 strong crowd carried on like that all day long, which is, we talk about fake news from America, but as we watched the news that night, it was fake news. And it's certainly real footage and real events that actually took place, but the way it was presented was quite misleading. And of course, then that was watched by the young Arabic Muslim community, who became so enraged with what they'd seen and the way it'd been presented that we then experienced these revenge attacks right across Sydney. And they went on for numerous nights, and in fact, it followed on for weeks, if not months, of intelligence that we had to deal with, of possible incidents that were going to occur. And some of them we've revealed in the book, which are extreme risk intelligence events, which we'll probably talk about a bit later. But there's no footage whatsoever, because the media, as they often do, hunt in a pack, have decided about 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the actual day, things were winding down. They decided it's all over. So pat ourselves on the back. We've got this footage, off we go. Well, I can rest assured, I can tell you now that the day had just begun for the New South Wales Police, and certainly the Police Minister and the government, because the revenge attacks were tenfold, and that's a light figure putting on it, worse than anything that occurred during the day. And we had literally gangs of up to 50 carloads of young Arabic Muslim men that were travelling throughout suburbs and literally destroying those suburbs from top to bottom, and rampaging through streets with baseball bats, knives, guns, breaking car windows, shop windows, baseball batting anyone that was a Caucasian just for the sake of being on the street. Churches were burnt down and so forth. And Christian churches were burnt down across Sydney in the western suburbs, 3, I think. So there was like lots of problematic issues arising on multiple fronts, but there's no footage of this because the media had gone home and we're literally out to dinner. And then what we see because of that, as Carl said, if you Google, I dare you, Google the Cronulla Riots, all you will see is these focused upfront, many-angled footages of stupid, inebriated Caucasian young males during the daytime event, in the complete exclusion of, firstly, the build-up and some of the horrendous behaviour that was occurring in the build-up to the riot, and, of course, complete exclusion of these revenge attacks. So academics and journalists and keyboard warriors over the years have put together their views and theories on it, which is extremely skewed and one-sided, quite woke. And we're left with these reports, and there's literally dozens of them all over the internet and so forth, that the entire Cronulla and Sutherland Shire are white racist bogans, and it's the capital of white supremacy of Australia. And even now, even though it's like 19-year anniversary today as we record this, even now, every time racism is brought up in Australia, they'll wheel out those footage from the daytime events, look at those white racists and so forth. And look, as I said, the images are real, but it is in the complete exclusion of the overall event. So our book sets out from woe to go the actual factual sequential events of what occurred and a certainly analysis of that, which paints a quite different picture.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Carl. It's really good to have a much clearer and full picture. I can tell you the 3 themes that are emerging for me right away, and I want to unpack at least 2 of them. So the role of the media in this, absolutely, I want to unpack that. There's this element around extremism, and I'll share my view on this one right now, and that is I'm a proud Australian. I'm absolutely not racist. In fact, I despise any kind of racism or discrimination. I know Australians that are racist, openly racist, but there are a very small percentage of the population. And I'd coin it like, just because the Australians are good at rugby, we have the Wallabies, that means that every single Australian must be a rugby player. That's what it's like to be. Yes, there are racists in Australia, but it doesn't mean that all of Australia is racist. Yes, there are racist people in other cultures. That doesn't mean that any other culture is blatantly and openly and pervasively racist. So I think the proportionality of what you're talking about is also really clear. And then the third one is the tribalism, and I want to come to the tribalism in a moment. So, Carl, I'd like to double down a little bit on the role of the media here. I know this might be a little uncomfortable, and you as a politician, a seasoned politician for many years, I'm sure you've got an interesting relationship with the media. What I'm curious here, how do we get in this situation where I feel like the reporters that are on the scene at the time, that if they go home or go back to the studio without a story, they get fired, or that they're looking for that sensational story.
This is an example. A key thing, I think, in understanding truth is to understand what it means. It's contextual, and it must rest upon a rock of evidence and facts. And so some would probably find our notion that Sutherland is not full of racist white Australians. Some even argue that only white people can be racist. We try and present the view, but it's tough against the barrage of media record. And at the time, they were unhelpful. But the biggest medium, or media, was actually text messaging. 270,000 text messages. And folks don't start to protest and do awful things unless there's some reason for it. And what we bring to bear in our analysis is an explanation of deviant behaviour, morally, politically, racially. People will react in a certain way that's otherwise unacceptable if they feel a threat. So just because the Daily Telegraph says, isn't it terrible to thump a lifeguard, doesn't mean people are going to start storming the barricades. And likewise, just because there's a few text messages suggesting people turn up and thump some Lebanese Muslims, there has to have been something more. And so the Daily Telegraph, Alan Jones, they were unhelpful. In a couple of instances, the Daily Telegraph, where it published a threat from Kobe Aberton, from the head of the Bra Boys, that the Lebanese gangs were too scared to come to Maroubra, that directly resulted in Maroubra being smashed up. It was really irresponsible journalism. Alan Jones, we have a section about, did Alan Jones cause the riots? No, he didn't. Was he helpful? No, he wasn't. Was he found to have incited discontent? Yes, on a few occasions. But, Mick, his audience were not the audience at North Cronulla Beach. They were all like Statler and Waldorf in the Muppets. They were all in Sesame Street. They were all up in the bleachers, shaking their fist in agreement, and they went home or had a cup of tea. So Alan was unhelpful. Alan Jones was unhelpful. Daily Telegraph, that one particular example. But no question in my mind, the videographic evidence of the evening, I think, provoked the revenge attacks. It was really irresponsible journalism. And remember the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. And it was a great yarn spliced together, and it was shocking because the trouble is, Mick, the footage is real. The footage is not fake. Those spliced things are not unfactual, if that's a word. They are true. Those things happen. But joining them all together gave a very misleading picture of what was actually happening. As Mark said, most of the day was boring and people were just drinking, got in the sun, a few hundred got carried away. So yes, the media souped it up in certain ways and did contribute it. They didn't cause it. There's been simmering discontent between the two tribes for years and years. And we call it the towel versus the soccer ball. And it wasn't right or wrong. It was a different cultural approach to how you should use the beach. There was a lot of misogynistic language, some really vile conversations directed at young women, which I think if the surfers of Cronulla had taken the train to Lakemba and got out and said those things to young Muslim women, there would have been a riot on the spot. There wouldn't have been any simmering discontent. So the concern we have is that all this simmering discontent was souped up a bit and into a moral panic by the media. They were unhelpful, but the fuel, the kindling was ready to be ignited, and it just happened to be the lifeguards getting thumped. But it was already there. It was already, and these pervasive messages were telling a story people wanted to hear. So the media has to share some burden, but there were reasons other than it being put in the telly or on talkback radio. Folks were pretty angry and they reacted. And then the Lebanese community was pretty angry about how they was perceived that a large crowd in Sydney were attacking them for no good reason, then they didn't look Caucasian. And then they did the same thing. But there were other things than just, you don't look like me, you don't go to the church I go to. And by the way, Mick, Mark and I did extensive research and we were looking for solace and succor through the scholarship of serious academics. And we researched a lot of papers and a lot of work, and most of it is rubbish because almost very few, close to none, actually did their own research. They just opine in otherwise peer-reviewed journals, repeating the mantra of the white man is racist and racism central is North Cronulla Beach. And so, as we said, we challenge that truth based not on our opinion, based on our own research, interviewing 12 people and looking at the facts and what happened. But the trouble is, in 10 years' time, Mick, you and your listeners, I know you'll be on podcast 500 by then. Anyone Googles it, it'll be the same story. Yeah. It's embedded in the DNA. If history has a DNA or a psyche, if you can personify history, the DNA of that person is almost immovable despite the efforts of our book.
Yeah, so it is a little bit of revisionist history, both in real time and after the fact, right? So we're seeing the world through the lens of what the media wanted us to see. And I'm worried about the lack of accountability for that. I worry about if it bleeds, it leads. I also worry a little bit about human behavior, that we're also the ones that go home and turn on the TV and watch the news as well. And would we watch a story that says, oh, there was a very peaceful protest at Cronulla Beach today? Or are we going to tune in to the sensational story? It actually reflects a little bit on us as consumers, as well as what the media then portrays. And I worry about the lack of accountability there. And
Perhaps
I've
if
got
I
to,
can
Carl.
give a little anecdote, Mick. I was opening the $14 million upgrade Rockdale Railway Station when I was Minister for Transport. And this guy from Channel 10 came up and said, "Oh, Minister, look, yeah, great yarn, yeah, good on you. But look, I've got this story that the opposition leaders put out." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I heard that. It's just not true." And he said, "Oh, we're going to run with it unless you give us something else." And I said, "But it's just not true." So I had to stand up saying it's not true. And they gave that a great run. I said, "But you know it's not true." And he said, "Yeah, we've got a 1 hour program. You've got to fill it with something." That's why we quote, I think in the book, "It's a Good News Day," which is a great song from the 60s. If it's noise, if it's negative. And sadly, it fits the more recent notion of academics being under pressure to take a certain view about Caucasian community. And that could be misunderstood. And we've made it clear that we do not intend in any way to fuel those who might want to misunderstand what we're saying. We're saying that you can't point the finger at one part of the equation. Both had small numbers behaving despicably, and when you look at the evidence that we put out, the text messages were vile and racist and sought violence upon the other. But we asked a simple question: why were they talking like this? And the academics, who we thought would give us answers, didn't bother asking. They generally just said, "Oh, what a horrible way." One of them just said this was like a pogrom. I mean, that's just so insulting to those victims of pogroms and mass extermination, to suggest that this was some kind of Holocaust equivalent. And then others talk about mass hysterical violence from 5,000 marauding Cronulla residents. So it's very frustrating, and we got no solace from that research, and we had to do it ourselves, which was frustrating. I thought there'd be an easier path, Mick, in writing the book. We have to write that ourselves, really.
And thank you for doing that, by the way, Carl. Look, let's unpack it a bit now. I think we've covered enough around the media certainly not helping this. And the way I describe it, by the way, and having researched your work, to me, it's like a compounding series of disproportionate responses. So it started off as something, someone then defends something, and then it just compounds from there, including the revenge attacks, and then fueled by very myopic perspectives being presented by the media. But let's get into the...
Mark. Mark's probably better placed. He's closer, even though I overall oversight, strategic control and supervision of it. Mark was the operational commander for the government and the community. But I think if I summed it up in a slangy sort of way, it was a biff that got out of hand, and male preening on the beach, a bit of bravo, bit of fisticuffs that just kept escalating till it blew up. And then it subsided and went away. I see it as, probably now would look back embarrassed about it. Using each other. And yes, it got all out of hand. I don't know, Mark, different perspective on it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Mark, about the kind of compounding, disproportionate responses that I was talking about. And to be clear, I wasn't talking about the police there. I was talking about against each other. I thought the police response was very clear. But what's your respect to the biff? All right.
I'll just be quick, Nick, because I know you want to move on to other topics, but sorry, I haven't been able to get a word in. But I'll give you a couple of real-life examples from the day. So the next day, there was a front-page article from one of the leading Sydney newspapers of a male person. He's a local identity at the Cronulla area. I won't mention him by name here. But he's a quintessential big, solid, hairy-backed Australian male. He was a first-grade footballer at one stage, and he was wearing his Aussie cap, and he was up on a milk crate with a loud hailer, and they snapped this photograph of him. And here it is, front page of the next day. Well, what he was actually doing in his milk crate, he was yelling out to the crowd, "We're not here to fight the police today. They're all white men like us. We want to respect in this crowd." And he starts chants, "Cops are tops." And he starts 3 cheers for the cops, hip hooray. It looks like he's yelling in his megaphone, but that's the reality of what he actually was doing. But let's not that get in the way of a good story. So none of that gets reported, just the photograph of him looking like the insider of the riots. That's one example. Another quick one, if I may. On the actual day down there, the North Cronulla Surf Club CEO came and saw me because they'd pre-organised a surf boat launch. One of their new surf boats was being launched, and there was a parade and there was nippers and all those sorts of things on the beach. He was very concerned about whether they should still run that event. So I said, look, mate, I don't think you'd get a more patriotic crowd, to be honest with you. So give it a go. You've got plenty of police here and we'll see what happens. Anyway, the surf boat was launched and the crowd cheered on and it was having a well of a time. None of it was reported. It's completely spliced out of anything from the whole day. So these are just examples of what I mean, of how the manipulation of it. So what is real footage of these inebriated young white males who carried on in the afternoon whilst drunk, spurred on by white supremacist spruikers that had hijacked the day. But all the actual other stuff, like I just mentioned, the fellow up on his milk crate, on his megaphone, great pick, but he's not inciting a riot. He's yelling out cops at cops. And the surf boat launch and things like that, all spliced and all deleted from the footage and from the narrative because it didn't suit the agenda.
That's definitely not going to be the headline, Mark. I can tell you that based on everything we've been saying about the way it gets reported. Let's get into the human behaviour side. Now, I've heard both of you say that you're frustrated that maybe there isn't a good explanation for the way it went. So let's have a go at myself. And I'll be opining myself here, Carl, right? So I subscribe to William Glass's view around what he calls choice theory and about 5 fundamental human needs that we have. The need for survival, and this is where things like fight, flight, or freeze come, and where we might start making decisions in the moment that, our root brain is kicked in. We're not thinking anymore. We're just in survival mode. The need for love and belonging, to feel like we belong to something bigger than ourselves, the tribalism that we talk about, the need for power, the need for fun, and the need for freedom are the things that he talks about. And when I was reading your accounts of these, and I'm thinking about, let's use the 2 tribes metaphor, we'll continue with that. I feel that this love and belonging and this survival is what's kicking in. And the want to belong then becomes greater than the need to be right. And I've heard you, Carl, and you said it just before, but I've heard you say it before, that there's probably people that did things on that day that the next day they probably scratch their head and go, did I really behave like that? But in the heat of the moment, whether it's survival instinct or it's the need for love and belonging being greater than the need to be right, they get away on themselves. Is this what's happening here?
Look, tribalism is an interesting human phenomena, and we all need to be in groups, and most of us are in many groups. Could be a fan group, a religious organisation, parents and friends at your school, where your kids are, or a political party. Most of us are in multiple tribes, and the vast majority of the time they're peaceful. They don't threaten anyone. They're just things you enjoy doing. But occasionally this need to belong, to be in a group, can conflict with another group. Yeah. And what we try to explain, we try and go beyond into the realm of being in a tribe can involve the pleasure of exclusion, that your group is special because you don't let some people in. And that can then lead to a defense of the group. And you're right. Sometimes people act in a way that may not even be in their interests, but it's in the interests of the group, and it can be quite deviant. And so we try to explain it sociologically as you start escalating from a book club to a group that wants to exclude and then gets violent. That we explain it by arguing, we draw on Professor Karen Stenner's work she called it the authoritarian dynamic, and she said fundamentally most people, most of the time, when they behave aberrantly, it's when they feel a threat to the interests of their group.
Yeah.
And not because they're racist or politically or morally deviant, but they might say and do things like how many times do you hear people that if someone is not of their colour or religion, that serves them in a way that is not acceptable, and they'll say a racist thing. And people say, oh, you're a racist. And you go, yeah, but there's something more going on. That's just at an individual level. What about at a whole group level? Does that mean the whole group is racist or deviant because it's reacted in a certain way? And she argued that it was intolerance to difference, not racism, that drove most reactions when people behave in a way that they probably wouldn't otherwise. Now, that doesn't mean that none of us have simmering under the surface an ability to behave that way. Many of us, actually, sadly, are quite capable of saying racist things, unacceptable things, when provoked, when threatened. And we analyse what were the threats on the beach. And there are all sorts of things around disrespect and incivility. You're not in my group. You want to be here and I want to be here and my mates want to be here and you should be there. And that's far more complicated than just saying, oh, you're all racist. Probably best I'll get Mark to add to that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your view, Mark. And then I'm going to add to it then what happens is when the alcohol comes into the mix. So we've got let's call it the survival instinct, the fear of being under attack, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the different. There's the love and belonging, the exclusion versus defend my own, etc. And then we add alcohol into the mix. And Mark, I'm going to say, as a decorated police officer, this was not your first rodeo that involved alcohol. What role does alcohol play here?
Alcohol played a significant role in the day. Like I said, the morning was more like an Australia Day. And people are celebrating and singing the national anthem and we'll sing Matilda and there was barbecues cooking and it was more like a carnival atmosphere. And as I said, I emphasised the fact that it was hijacked by white supremacists who turned up down there. But it was really much of a carnival type atmosphere. And then the alcohol kicked in. And we've spoken to lots of young people, certainly I have, in the area, and I know a lot of them and I know a lot of their parents who said, I completely lost my way and I look back at my behaviour and I'm disgraced with myself, exactly as you said. And I can't believe I acted the way I did. I was caught up in the atmosphere of it. I got caught up by these spruikers and chants that were occurring and then I know I got filmed and I'm embarrassed by it. But the alcohol did play a huge role, so much so that actually the local area commander, Rob Redfern, who on the day, he was the operational commander for the event, and he had built up a quite strong relationship already with the licensed premises owners and licensees in the area through a liquor licensing accord that they had already had running. And luckily, through that good relationship, he requested them to close down liquor sales, and they did so. And interestingly, when the grog ran out and the sun was going down, the event was over, and because there was like nothing more to drink, and we actually had a bit of a strategy on the side. We actually took a lot of the police off the street at that point, and then the thundering helicopter overhead, we took it back to it landed in a nearby oval to make it actually look like the whole event was over. And it actually did work. And people thought, oh, it's all over. It's time to go home. There's no more grog to drink and the party's over, and they all left, including the media. But we've already talked about that. So alcohol did play a big event on the day, most definitely. And you're talking about tribes, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I was going to mention about tribes. So interestingly, Carl's already touched on this, but we all belong to numerous tribes in our life, and that's whether that be sport, religion, politics. And I think if you go to any arena and there's a football match or an AFL match, and everyone's wearing their club colours and they all hate each other because that's not the person wearing my club colours. If you stopped that and said, right now, I want you to all sit in your religious beliefs, and then next minute they'd be sitting next to and cuddling the person wearing the opposite jersey because they've got the same religious belief. And that's what we're talking about now. And it's like, okay, now let's talk about politics. And those same people would let go of their cuddle and start punching on again. You see, in life, we're part of various tribes. And on this occasion, it was certainly the surf culture tribe versus the gangster tribe of the Western suburbs, you know?
Yeah.
And that leads me to about behaviour as well, because we look very carefully at what really caused this. And it's being labelled racist immediately over the years. And what we say is that the actual root cause, if you actually pull back the onion layers and have a deep look at what the causal factors were for this, it was about behaviour. And if you go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was always been tension and problems at Cronulla Beach because, firstly, it's the only beach in Sydney with a railway line, so it does attract a large number of people that arrive by train from the western suburbs of a weekend in groups and so forth. So there's always been, but back in those decades gone by, there was Westies, Bankies, Rockers, Sharpies, and different groups over the decades that have turned up at Cronulla. But it was the same sort of behaviour. It was incivility. It was comments, misogynistic comments made to young girls. It was about leaving rubbish all over the beach at the end of the day. It was about strutting around and intimidating people and acting like gangsters. And it's like, well, that's what we do at the beach. Here we actually act peacefully and calmly, and your behaviour is not welcome here as part of our tribe. And there was punch-ons and fights between those groups back then, but it was all Caucasians. One Caucasian group fighting the other Caucasian group. So fast forward to the 2000s, and a new group emerged on the beach, which was the young Lebanese Muslims from the western suburbs. Same behaviour, exactly the same behaviour, but the minute the punch-on started, it was, racist. Well, and that's what that's been perpetuated over the years in many papers, that, this was all about racism. Well, I think it's actually lazy to say and do your research and talk to the local people. I mean, I know for a fact that Carl and I have never been interviewed for any of these academic papers or journalistic writings, which is quite bizarre, really. And so say the same people from most people that I've spoken to in the Cronulla area that will tell you the same story, that it was all about the behaviour down there that caused it. But we are now labelled all across the world as the racist enclave of Australia, and it's rubbish. So, and it was about the tribes fighting and the conflict between the tribes. And there's always tribalism and conflict, but it takes a spark event, which was the assault on the lifeguards in this case, that then gave it a certain level of threat that then people acted the way they did.
Yeah, understood. So what I'm hearing is the antisocial behaviour, then the reaction to that antisocial behaviour, and then everything just compounds from there, fueled by, let's say, media's perspective being one certain perspective, and then fueled also by alcohol. And what I was also hearing from you before, Mark, is when the fuel was turned off, both the media and the alcohol, at least the events on the day calmed down. It was further fueled later on with the revenge attacks, and that was probably not helped by the media again. But yeah, I see what you mean. That's not a racial thing. That's a antisocial behaviour, a values, a sticking up for what's right event that got out of hand and then got further out of hand when the two elements of fuel were added. Like in the
60s and 70s, it was F off Westies, F off Bankies, F off Sharpies. But the minute it became F off Lebs, racist,
it's got to be
the
racist.
tag was labelled all over it. And it really, yes, it's a racist wording, but it wasn't the real underlying issue. And as I clearly outlined, it was about the behaviour that was going on. I have certainly and spoken to hundreds, if not thousands, of locals over the years, and they will all tell you the same thing. They have all these academics that have written these papers spoken to them. I've not heard one person tell me they have been interviewed for any of those papers.
All right, interesting. I'm going to ask you a quite challenging question. Let's start with you on this one, Carl. And it's a bit of a crystal ball. All of this happened on the cusp of what we now know to be social media. So you mentioned about text messages and how that started some of the groupthink and the tribalism and fueled some of that as well. What do you think would happen today? With the prevalence of social media today, would it have been substantially worse? What would happen?
I think it would have been worse because it would have been more pervasive. Mm-hmm. So you need a persuasive message to be delivered pervasively with an underlying purpose. So the purpose is people are angry and they want to do something about it. And a message comes in a number of forms, becomes more pervasive, more persuasive, So thank goodness it wasn't available. But one of the things I do say, and Mark would be better placed, the government set up and the police set up Task Force Gain in the 90s, and we locked up about 20 very violent, nasty Lebanese Muslim criminals. Had they not been locked up, that would have made it a whole lot worse, because they would have been providing all sorts of horrible leadership. They weren't available. Secondly, yes, I think it was a blessing that it was only text messages, but this was the first time text messages led to chain messaging. There was no example before it where people were sending messages to groups of people and onto groups of people, and one message was hitting thousands of people. That was unusual. But I do think it would have been very unhelpful if all those other forums had been available. But once again, Mick, they have been available for 20 plus years, and it hasn't returned.
Hasn't recurred. One thing that does happen though, Carl, is the algorithmic bias, right? So that's there, but we haven't seen another day like the 11th of December 2005 since that I can recall. Yeah, interesting.
There have been events. There's always events.
Yeah.
But there hasn't been a Cronulla since.
All right, so now I want to unpack your leadership on the day here for a moment, Carl and Mark. And I'm going to say, first of all, congratulations on your leadership. This could have been a whole heap worse. That draws us to a conclusion of part one of this compelling two-part series with Carl Scully and Mark Goodwin. I hope this interview is giving you a clearer view as to what really happened on those days. In the next episode, Carl and Mark are going to share with us the deep leadership lessons they learned about crisis management and leading a team through these difficult times. We'll unpack further the impact of social media, and Mark and Carl will openly share with us the impact these events had on their careers and their families. Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mixbeers.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.